sophomore, any freshmen, any juniors, anybody finished with undergrad? Okay, so we have freshman and sophomore. Great. Any senior students or anybody who's just about, okay, we do have a senior. Okay, good. So, all right, so we have a range. So I've tried to prepare for that to make sure I account for those who might be at the beginning of this process and those who are ready to apply. So I'm going to talk, as I said, about some of the things you can be doing before you apply. And this is the largest chunk. This is what matters really, is all the stuff you do before you start that application as a freshman, sophomore, etc. And then I'll go through the application components and a little bit about the interview and, making a decision. So the most important thing really is your coursework. So I'm going to spend some time talking about that and how you should maximize that. It is your primary focus. Your degree is based entirely on your coursework. That's actually why you are in school right now. And there are going to be a lot of opportunities to do a bunch of other things, and they're going to seem thrilling and compelling, but really this should be your first and foremost concern, is the coursework that you're doing. So a few things you want to consider. Number one, your GPA is sort of the standardized metric that we can use to compare you across different institutions. And so you want it to be as high as possible because it's sort of the first judgment factor, for better or for worse. So let's think a little bit about the application review process. Most programs are going to have anywhere from 4 to 12 slots that they're going to fill in a year. So I'm giving an example here of a program that has 6 slots that need to be filled, but they're going to get hundreds of applications, right? 200, 300, 400, depending on the program. And they have to find a way to select just 6 people to fill these slots. Now, typically for every application, you want to have about 3 reviewers. So 3 people who will look thoroughly at that application and give their feedback and give their recommendation, which means if I have 300 applications, I need about 900 reviews. Now, a review committee usually has 5 or 6 people, but let's be generous and say there's a review committee that has 10 people. That would mean that each person has to review 90 applications, which is just not feasible. So what happens typically is there's an upfront triage process where some of those students have to be eliminated. Some of those applications have to be thrown out. The first set that will be thrown out will be incomplete applications, applications that don't have the appropriate information, they were not filled out correctly. So you want to make sure, of course, you follow instructions and do it the correct way. And then, of course, there's some people who don't meet requirements. So you might have the occasional person who tries to apply when they're still a junior and they don't have enough credits and things like that. So those get tossed out. But then the next line really is going to be your GPA. That is the one thing that we can look at, a single value for every applicant and sort of rank and say, all right, well, we can exclude this group and use this top 100 or top 150 where we can go in and look more closely at your application. So if your GPA is low enough, even if the rest of your application looks good, probably people won't see it. So you want to make sure it's as high as possible so that you at least get in the door to have your application reviewed. Now, once you made it and passed that triage and it goes out to be reviewed, we're going to be looking closely at the transcript. So the GPA isn't the only factor. We're looking at the actual courses. So as a biology major, you definitely want to have genetics, micro, cell and molecular biology. If you're not a bio major, let's say you're a chem or a computer science major and you're applying to a more biology-based PhD, then you want to try and make sure that you get at least some cell and molecular biology, or at least one of these in addition to your other sciences. And then, so these are kind of required more or less. And then these are other recommended advanced courses you should try to have. You don't have to have all of them, but it's good to have 1 or 2 of them, especially depending on what you're interested in. So if you're applying to a neuroscience program and there's a neuroscience course at your school, you should probably take a neuroscience course, and so forth. And then of course you need your organic chem 1 and 2, your physics. For math, regardless of what your major requires. So some major biology majors, for instance, might only require pre-cal or college algebra. it doesn't matter. You need to try to have at least calculus one. The more math you have, usually the better. And of course, we're looking at the grades. So we want to know that you have the content, but that you have a good grasp on the content. So for these kinds of courses, you should be aiming for A's. A B might be okay. No C's, no D's. If you get a C or below, you should try to repeat that class, and you should be thinking about ways to make up for the loss of that course. Right, then it's important to remember too that the content that you're learning as an undergrad is exactly the content you need for your graduate training. So in some fields, you know, you can get like a business degree and you just kind of need a degree to get in the door, and then you learn the job on the job. When it comes to biomed programs, a lot of what you're going to do in grad school is building on what you learned in undergrad. So that content is actually very important. The biology, the micro, the genetics, all that stuff you learn, they're going to be building on it. So for example, over about 4 years, you're roughly going to be learning this, right? You're going to learn what DNA is, what a gene is, what transcription is, how these work, and so forth, what's protein. Over multiple classes, many hours, and then you get to grad school, and in the course of a week, now you also have to learn all these other stuff. So it means if you didn't have a good concept or good grasp on this information early on, then it's going to be very difficult for you to now build on all this stuff. And you're not going to have time in the course of a week to review what you should have learned over 4 years. And oftentimes, even one section of this information could be even more complex, and they're just building on it and building on it. So it's good to have that foundation. Make sure you actually understand the content while you're learning it. So when you get to grad school, it'll be much more doable for you to get through coursework. Also, what you're learning in the classroom is directly applied to what you're doing in lab. You come to my lab, I can teach you to do a Western blot in a day or two, but I cannot teach you all of the science behind what it takes to, you know, why a Western blot works, what it is, why we're doing what we're doing. So if you have that good concept, get those good concepts in the classroom, you're going to apply them when you get into the lab, and it shows. I can often tell a student who, you know, I can just tell them, okay, do this, do that, and they kind of follow just basic instructions more on the technical side, versus a student who understands and can ask the right questions and can challenge things, and it makes sense why we're using this buffer and why it has to be hot or why it has to be cold. All of that is coming from your coursework. You also want to consider that coursework is the most difficult and often the most expensive thing to compensate for after the fact. Meaning, I like to give the example of Jason and Derek, right? So Jason isn't quite sure what career he wants, but he's a biology major, so he focuses only on his coursework. And I'm giving sort of extreme examples here. Most people don't necessarily fit these categories, but sort of giving extreme comparisons. So he ends up with a 4.0 at graduation, which means all his advanced courses, you know, advanced math, Cal 2, Cal 3, he has A's. He doesn't have any research experience, so he's not able to apply for a PhD program yet. However, he has options. He can go to a postbac program. He'll probably get it no problem. All he needs is a letter to show that he's enthusiastic about research and some good letters of recommendation. He can do a master's program with a 4.0 GPA. He'll get it anywhere. Or he can apply for jobs where he will get experience in the lab. Derek, on the other hand, knew upfront that he wanted to be a scientist. So very early on, he found a lab and has a lot of research experience, but didn't focus quite as much on his courses. And I understand here that your GPA is not just based on whether or not you were focused or not. People go through a lot of challenges and so forth and so on, but I'm sort of giving a very specific example here. For instance, Derek really wants to get a publication, so sometimes he skips that geography class because he thinks I don't really need that to be in the lab, and then he fails that class. His GPA gets pulled down. In his advanced courses, he gets some B's, but he also has some C's. Well, his options are going to be way more difficult, right? Because it's going to be hard for him to get rid of those C's on his transcript. In fact, he cannot. They will always be there. To get into a postbac would be more difficult. The Hopkins postbac program, a 3.0 is the minimum. Other programs like the NIH, they don't give a minimum. They say they don't have a minimum, but it states on their website that it's very difficult. You very rarely find somebody with less than a 3.0. So, you know, when you're dipping into that 2 point something range, your options become very, very limited. You can get in a job would probably be the most likely option, but even that will vary, because if I'm hiring somebody with a less than 3, then I'm thinking, well, this person might not have as much a grasp on the science. I'm going to want them more for technical things. Here's a thing and give you instructions, you do it, versus somebody with a higher GPA where I'm like, all right, well, let me involve you in a project, and now you get to have your own project, which could be helpful for you to apply to grad school. So, so just kind of giving two contrasts here where there are a lot of opportunities later on to get research experience and to build other things. It's a lot more difficult to compensate for the coursework if you didn't do it in the first place. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying if you don't have an ideal GPA that all hope is lost, that you should give up and go home and you could never get into a PhD program. That's not true. There are plenty of people who started off really rough and they managed to get into grad school and they've thrived and done well. But it is something you want to focus on if you can. You don't want to go that difficult route. If you can work on it now, whether that means getting a tutor, that means going to office hours, that means restructuring how you study. Maybe you need to cut some things and prioritize. Maybe, dance might be a bit too much right now. You just need to get your foot in and get your courses up before you can go back to the extracurriculars. You want to think about those things and make that your primary focus, get that in order, and then you could add things on top of that. So your next thing will be your research experience. I would always encourage people to start local, meaning find research at your home institution. So some people will make the mistake of saying, well, I want to do breast cancer research, but there's no breast cancer research at my institution. So I'm just going to not do research and then I'll apply to Hopkins in the summer and go do research there. The problem is when you send in that application and you've never done research before, we probably, unless there are no options for you to do research at your home institution, you're less likely to be accepted because, of course, we have so many people applying. We're looking for people who have at least tried it out, have gone to a lab, have shown enthusiasm. We know you're actually interested in research. You've gotten some of the basic skills, and now you're trying to build on that. If your home institution doesn't have research, you should be looking close by. What's the next nearby institution that might have a place? Maybe they're only chemistry labs. Maybe they're only psychology labs. But if you go to a psychology lab, you could learn how to collect data. You could learn how to do data analysis. And that shows, okay, you're really interested. Now, when you write that letter for your summer program, you can say, hey, this is what I had the option to do. I did it. I gained these skills and I want to do more. That's a really good application. You probably will get a spot. Then that early research, both locally and when you go to these summer programs, is really for your exploration. This is how you figure out what it is you're really interested in, what kind of science. There are all these different areas, right? Bioengineering, neuroscience, genetics, pharmacology. What do these things mean, right? You going into a lab and saying, oh, that sounds interesting, let me do that. And then talking to your mentors, well, what do you call this kind of science? What do you call this discipline? Could help you figure out what kinds of programs you'd be interested in later on. You're also trying to gain some fundamental skills. The same types of experiments people do in a fly lab or a mouse lab are often very similar, right? The same PCR and Western blot and using a scale to measure things and wearing proper protective equipment and so forth. All of those fundamental skills are what you're trying to gain at that point. I will also say if you join a lab, you should try to be fully independent in at least one technique, right? When I say fully independent, I mean you should be able to come to my lab and I tell you, okay, there are all the materials over there, here are the samples, and you do it. Meaning you could think about your controls, you can set up the apparatus, you can actually run the experiment, you can collect the data, you can analyze the data, you can interpret the data. That's what you're aiming for, is that you could become independent in doing at least a few skills. And of course, getting comfortable with, okay, how do you ask a question? Why would you do this experiment versus that experiment? That's what you're trying to gain at that point. So by the time you're applying to a PhD program, you're pretty comfortable in that realm and you can walk in comfortably saying, well, I know this is what I like and this is what I know how to do and this is what else I want to learn. These research experiences are also a great place for you to build your network and increase your mentorship. And I want to let people know you do not need a first author publication to get into a PhD program. I think that's a misnomer. Most people who get into PhD programs do not have a first author publication. Now, publishing is good. If you have the option to publish, you should. But you should not seek out a first author at the expense of other things. So, for example, you don't want to be missing classes or not studying for courses because you're spending all this time in the lab hoping to get enough data because you want this paper, right? Don't jeopardize your coursework and your GPA and all the other stuff in order to get that first author. Because if you don't have the correct GPA, even having a first author publication is not going to get you into grad school. Similarly, you don't want to stay in a lab that's toxic, that you don't actually enjoy the science, but you came as a freshman, so now you figure you have to stick it out for 3 years just so you could get a paper. That's probably not worth it. Use the time to go and find what kind of lab you like, find what kind of science you like, and really explore and be prepared so that when you get to the grad school level, you can say, okay, that's the program I want to go to, and these are the things I want to do. These are the things I don't want to do. So mentorship and networking, this is massive. You know, most people take this for granted at this early stage, but your mentors are really, really important. And you have a role to play in that mentor-mentee relationship, right? It's not all on the mentor. So for example, you take a class, maybe you take organic chemistry one, you get along really well with the professor, you really like them and so on. If you've interacted a lot, you've gone to office hours during the class. Well, maybe they're not teaching you organic chem too, but that doesn't mean you can't send them an email and say, hey, this is how my class is going, or is it okay if we meet? I just want to give you some updates. And usually if you're taking that initiative, most faculty members will reach out and continue that sort of mentoring. Similarly, when you go for summer experiences, the postdoc or graduate student you work with, the PI whose lab you were in, reach out to them once a semester, once a year. Just let them know, hey, this is what I'm doing this summer. I'm doing this kind of research and so on, and kind of keep them in the loop. And that usually goes a long way. Okay, so for extracurriculars, if there's something you already enjoy doing and it's good for your self-care and it's good for your personal development, by all means do it. But do know that, these extracurriculars are not necessarily a prerequisite for PhD programs. When you were applying to undergrad, you probably needed to have, a bunch of extracurriculars and service activities and so forth. That's not really something that's critical to get into a PhD program. And certainly you don't want to be doing activities that at the expense of your coursework. So now, you've joined the dance team and you got to practice every single night and travel every weekend and so forth. And now your bio grades are slipping, your math grades are slipping, then you might want to reconsider, you might want to create some balance there. So it's good to do the stuff that you love, but you want to make sure that they're not taking over some of the other things you absolutely need. It's usually a good idea to pick one or two things that you are really interested in and you're really and go with those, as opposed to trying to do a whole bunch of stuff and then having this long list of, French club, I went to a meeting one time, and then, I did a semester of golf, and you're listing all these things. They're not really helping your application. They're just taking up space. But if there's one thing where it's like, hey, I've been doing this consistently, and, I would try to seek out leadership roles, right? Maybe get on the executive, be the secretary, the vice president, whatever. And then that's something that, you can list a little better on your application. You also don't need necessarily to be in a club or something to show leadership. Maybe you show leadership in the lab, right? So you come in, you're the most junior person, other people have to teach you. And then by the time you're a sophomore or junior, now you know where everything is. Now you know how to do this experiment. You can volunteer to help show the younger students how to do things. You can take ownership of your project. Those kinds of leadership activities will be noted, and they come out in your letters of recommendation. All right, so you've done all the things you're supposed to do, right? You have your coursework on lock, you've gotten some research experience, you're keeping in touch with your mentors, and you're asking them for advice and so forth and so on. Now you need to choose a program. How do you do that? Well, everything we just talked about, right? So you kind of first want to think about the science, what kind of program it is, whether it's going to be a neuroscience program, genetics, for instance. If you've already honed in, like, okay, I'm definitely doing something neuroscience related, then you're probably looking for neuroscience programs. What kind of courses you like will inform that. The research you did, which ones you like, which ones you didn't like, help to inform that. Conversations with your mentor and people in your network. And sometimes the extracurriculars could be helpful in showing, like, okay, I really love teaching, so I want to go to a program where I have the option to teach, or I think I like more outreach and service type things and so on, so I want to go to a program where there are options for that. And then of course there are also programs that are interdisciplinary, right? So they might not just be neuroscience or just cancer, right? You can do almost anything. And so that's where understanding the different kinds of programming will matter. This is the QR code for the next workshop, which is where to get a PhD. They're all people who are admissions chair of admission committees, and people who make decisions about who's going to get into grad school. So even if you're not interested in one of those specific programs, it's just good to go and hear what they think about when they're thinking about when they're accepting students, and understanding what the programming is like, right? Some programs are more teaching heavy, where you have to have a requirement to be a TA and teach a certain number of courses. Some might be more clinical oriented, where you have to have a clinical mentor or do shadowing in the hospital and things like that. And so you want to start getting an idea of, like, oh, that's what this kind of program is, or this is what they mean when they say translational and so forth and so on. And the earlier you grasp that, then the sooner you can kind of think of which programs you might need to apply to and what the requirements might be. Right. Then you want to consider the institutional climate. Does it matter to you that it's the top one of the top 10 institutions in the country, which I've listed here? A lot of times the program and the institution are different, right? So Johns Hopkins, for instance, is listed here, but Johns Hopkins has maybe 20 something graduate programs. And so if you're interested in, let's say genetics, for instance, the top genetics program might not be at one of these top 10 schools. So you want to think specifically about the program. If I'm doing genetics, it doesn't matter if I'm at the institution that has the best neuroscience program because I'm not doing neuroscience. But you also want to think about other things too, right? Is it a large institution? Does it have a lot of resources and so on? Or is it too large and you're going to get lost in it? Do you want to be at an institution where less than 2% of the faculty are people of color, right? Will you have good opportunities for mentorship? What kind of things do they have in place for first generation college students or underrepresented minorities? And actually, one of the speakers tomorrow from Hopkins is going to talk a lot about that. And then you also want to think about what kind of research you want to do. Some institutions will have, have hospitals on board and have access to a lot of human tissue, so you can do more translational work. Some might be more teaching heavy because they have an undergrad, and so you have a lot of teaching opportunities. So you want to think about the broader institution as well. And then location matters, right? If you hate the cold, don't go to Boston. No matter how great the school is, if you're going to be miserable every year for 6-7 months of the year, it's not worth it. You might want to consider where your family and support system is or are, because you're going to be there for 5 or 6 years, and it's going to be challenging. If you're in a PhD program, it's a challenging time, and so you don't want to also be in an environment that's too challenging. All right, so the actual application, best advice I can give you is start early, right? Most deadlines are about November to December. When is a good time to start? Now, okay? And you're like, oh, it's too far. Not really, because we're in April now, which means you have maybe about a month left on your campus, and then it's summer, right? The summer is kind of lost. So this is a good time to go and find out, okay, how do I get my transcript? Making sure you don't have any random holes on your account because you forgot to return a book to the library back in freshman year or something. And that could be a delay of a few weeks. If you try to get your transcript in November, it might come too late, right? Go figure out now what you need to do, who you need to talk to, start asking people for letters and what's the best way to go and so forth and so on. Most of the portals will probably open around August, September. So that's when you're getting back to school next semester. And so you want to already be prepared so that when that portal opens, you can go in, download the documents you need, check all the specifics, and be ready to ask questions so that if there are issues, you can always reach out to the program, reach out to the admin, get answers in time, and still have adequate time to complete the application. Follow the instructions carefully. So I talked about that triage process. If you submit the wrong thing or put this one thing somewhere else and so forth, those simple things, not so much because people are trying to be mean, but again, if you have 300 applications, why am I going to waste my time with the 2 applications who didn't follow instructions when 298 people managed to follow instructions and have all the requirements for the program? So you want to follow instructions carefully. All right, so the personal statement, you want to have multiple versions of this. So I would start off now just kind of writing something you think might be good, and then sharing it with maybe your colleagues, right? People in your class, your peer mentors. If you're in the HBCU mentoring program, your mentor is a good person to send this to and say, hey, can you give me some feedback? And you kind of work on that. You're going to get from your peers mostly sort of language review and did you understand what I was trying to say? And they know you really well. I might say, but hey, you didn't talk about this thing and that kind of stuff. And then once you've gone through that multiple times and you have a nice draft, then you send that to your mentor, and your mentor can now give it further critique. So your personal statement usually is sort of telling us who you are, right? We want to get some context beyond just the CV and the transcript. So you don't want to just go and take everything in your CV and your transcript and drop it in there and then that's it. I'm reading the same thing twice. You want to add some color to that. You can talk about your journey. How did you get to the point of wanting to get a PhD, right? For some people, it's a personal experience. Your grandmother had Alzheimer's and then you wanted to cure it. And where did that start? Maybe in a high school classroom and so forth. That was your inspiration. And then you've done this opportunity and this is what you learned here, and then you use that opportunity and this is where you're at now. Those kinds of things are helpful. You definitely want to show some enthusiasm for research. So I've read a few personal statements where people tell me about all the challenges they've had in life. And, at the end, I empathize, and so forth, but you still haven't told me why you want to come to grad school, right? You still haven't told me that, yes, this is what I want to do. I like this research. I want to be able to study this thing and so forth. That has to be apparent. You also want to give some enthusiasm for the specific program that you're applying to. So yes, I know you want to do a PhD, but why do you want to do a PhD in this program? And that's where understanding the different details about the programs, like why this one is structured this way and this one is structured that way, is helpful, because then you can say, hey, this thing that you will have us do, I think that's a good opportunity for me to develop this skill because of what I want to do in the future. All right. You also want to demonstrate some readiness and realism about doing a PhD, right? So this usually comes from you having done some research experience. So you can talk about, all right, I did this research, this project, and at first these things didn't work. And so I had to troubleshoot this stuff and so forth. And that taught me some resiliency. It also taught me that's how research works. And now I'm prepared to go about doing that. So we have a good idea, like, okay, you know what you're getting into by getting into a 5-year program, because you've seen some of it already over the last year or two. All right, now your research statement might be different from your personal statement. Most applications are going to ask for one statement, and so you're going to integrate them both. So you're kind of telling your personal story and interjecting the bits of research that you've done. Some applications might ask you to write two separate statements. So one will be sort of a personal narrative, and the other one is just a description of the research you've done. Either way, for your research, you generally want to describe all of your research activities. You don't have to go into as much detail, but even if they're not the same project, there's a way to sort of describe each one. For any project you've done, these are some of the points you want to hit. First, you want to give big picture background, right? So for example, I joined the Maynard lab, which studies how inflammation makes cancer more aggressive. Then you're going to identify what the problem is, or the gap in knowledge, the thing that the lab is trying to figure out. So a lab reported that the inflammation-related P2X4 receptor is overexpressed. However, so this is the thing we don't know. We know that it's overexpressed, but we don't know which cell types in the prostate cancer tissues express P2X4. So then you state either your objective or hypothesis. And this is where your mentors come in for you to kind of craft. Do we have an objective? Is there a hypothesis? What was the hypothesis? Do we have the same hypothesis? In this case, I'm giving an example of an objective, which is to assess P2X4 expression in prostate cancer tissues using IHC. I want to note here, whenever you use these acronyms and shortened forms, you should start by spelling out the whole word the first time and then putting the acronym in brackets, and then you only use the acronym thereafter. So you don't want to say prostate cancer, PCA, and then use PCA here, and then say prostate cancer there, and then PCA here, and go back and forth. You define it up top, and then you use the new definition going forward. Then you want to state your role. So the overall objective, of course, is to assess P2X4, but what did you specifically do in the lab? You can say, I learned IHC techniques, and I stayed tissues in collaboration with my postdoc mentor, and I also use Halo image analysis software to quantify the expression. Now, a lot of students will do this. They'll list all the experiments that they did, but they never tell me what they found, like what were the results. And that's the most exciting part for scientists to read. So tell us what happened in the project. We measured increased P2X4 expression in cancer versus benign. Maybe you don't have direct results, and that would happen a lot, right? Because you're at the undergrad level. Some of these projects are sort of new. And so it's okay to say that, for instance, we tried and the P2X4 antibody didn't work. And so we spent time optimizing and so forth, and this is what we plan to do next. Or we were able to detect P2X4 expression, but it wasn't different. There were no differences. It's fine to say those things. And then what's the implication? So you found a result, but what does it mean? Why should we care? What's the significance? So in this case, this suggests that there might be a role for this receptor in prostate cancer. And so future studies will now determine function. Sometimes you might do a summer project, you do half of the experiment, and then you leave, and you don't really get to find out what the results were. This again is where it's nice to keep in touch with the person you're doing work with, and you can say, hey, did you guys ever figure that out? And they might be able to tell you, this. But even if you're not there for that, you can always think about what would be the next question I ask. If I figured out this, what's the next thing? And also, what would be the implication for the broader field? So yes, it's nice to know what the function of these receptors are. For me, I'd probably go on to say here that these receptors actually, they're drugs that target them. And so ultimately, this would be getting to a therapy for prostate cancer. Or maybe your project is more looking at doing some kind of being able to diagnose and so forth and so on. So think about what does your science mean and why anybody else should care. That should all be captured. And what it's a lot to say. So sometimes you're gonna have to write it. It might be very long, and then you reread it and see how you can break it down to make it a little bit more concise. This is a link to one website. There are many that give sort of science objective verbs, so verbs you should use. So for instance, you don't want to describe your science by saying we wanted to see what would happen, or we were trying to understand and so on. Understand is not a really quantifiable verb, but you can say that I wanted to assess or examine or investigate. Those kinds of words do make your statement a little bit more readable. So you can go to here, or you can just Google science objective verbs, and that can sometimes help you to rewrite your statement. All right, so on to the CV or resume. Less is more. A lot of students think if I make my CV look really, really long, then I would look more successful. No, not really. If I have 40 applications to review, I don't want to read through your 5-page CV. So usually for undergrad, you can typically fit everything on one page. I wouldn't go more than 2 pages. Okay. So a bit more detail. You don't need to include your physical address. Nobody's mailing you anything, and that's just an opportunity for identity fraud and unsafe things. And then you have your education right away. So you can skip the relevant coursework. You can skip the statement about being an eager sophomore with fantastic communication skills who's going to cure cancer. We don't need to see all that. We have a personal statement from you. Go straight to the education. If you, by the time you're applying for a PhD, then you don't need to include your high school information. And in fact, for any applications you're doing before then, as long as you have a GPA from your undergrad, you can remove the high school information. So you include your undergrad here and anything you did after that. So if you also did a master's, you would include it. And of course, the time. Your research experience is the next thing. So this is any experience you've had research-wise. This one you can include high school. So if you did a research program in high school, you can include that. But this is not every job you've ever had. It's anything related to sort of research or science. You want to be very clear to list what program you were in, the name of the PI from the laboratory. If you didn't work directly with the PI, you can also include the mentor you worked with. You should have the project title, and it should be a descriptive title, right? So something I can get an idea of, like, okay, I have an idea of what this person was doing. In this case, because you also will have a personal statement or research statement where you're going to expand on your what you did, you don't necessarily need to describe it here. But if this were a standalone CV that you're sending to somebody, it might help to put a little bit of a description of what you did or what was involved in the project. Not to make it super long, but just to give people a snapshot. Okay. I've also seen some scenarios where people will send applications where they don't list a research experience here and then they talk about it in the personal statement, or they'll list 4 different research experiences but then only talk about one in the personal statement, and that's just confusing. I don't know if you forgot, I don't know if you didn't really do it, I don't know what you did, and they don't describe research at all. That's a flaw. You don't want to do that. You want to properly list everything here, and then you want to then discuss and describe these in your research statement or whatever statement you have to write. For your poster presentations and oral presentations, for instance, most times you're using the same poster. So you don't have to rewrite the poster 25 times for every meeting. You can just list the details for the poster, make sure your name is highlighted so it's easy to see. You could either underline it or bold it. Make sure that you have all the proper authors and the proper order of the authors. Whoever worked with you should be able to help you with that. And then you can list the different meetings you went to under it. So that takes less space. It's easier for the reviewer to read. And also it's probably easier on you as well. If you got a prize, you can highlight that here, so you don't necessarily need to list that under awards and honors, because now you're just making it longer for no reason and making me read the same thing twice. Okay, and you can list your skills. You don't need to describe these. Anybody who's reviewing your application knows what a Western blot is. You can put your other activities here. If you had a job while you're in school, this is a good place to list that. So if the job was not related to science, this is where it goes. We don't need a lot of detail. Maybe you worked at the Gap or McDonald's. I don't need to know what you did at McDonald's. You can just put it there. Maybe you put how many hours you worked. That gives me a little bit of context of, okay, this was a working student. So maybe they don't have a 4.0, but they were maintaining a job and doing research. That's a good thing for me to know. All right. And so I think this is the final section is your recommendation letter. So you want to ask early. Now would be a good time to start thinking about who you're going to ask and letting them know. You want to ask early because people are not on your timeline. You might have somebody in mind and they might take a sabbatical next semester and then you can't find them, or they go on maternity or family leave or something. So if you ask now, they might be able to tell you, well, actually, I'll be gone, but I can write it for you now and you can have it for later and things like that. Who are you asking? Your research mentors are primary. So the person you've done the most research with at your home institution, that's one letter. And then of course the summer experiences you have, that would be the rest of them. If for instance you had one person at your home institution, maybe you only did one research experience, then your third person can be a professor, somebody who taught you one of the sciences. Um, but it should be somebody who knows you really well. So you don't want a letter that sounds like Danielle Maynard was a student in my physics one class. She attended on time. She got an A in the class. You should allow her into your PhD program. That's a terrible letter. None of that stuff is bad, but also none of it is helpful, right? So you want somebody who you've interacted with, you've gone to office hours, preferably maybe somebody who taught you more than one course, somebody who could talk about maybe your skills in lab. Maybe they've overseen one of your science lab classes, so they know, okay, she picks up techniques quickly. She can work well with a group. She's willing to take lead or to follow and things like that. Those kinds of details that are not on your CV or transcript are helpful to us. You do not ask your high school teachers. You don't ask your non-STEM faculty, your church community leaders, etc. Right? These are people who can. We're not trying to get somebody to assess you as a good person. I'm sure you're a good person, but we want to know your potential as a scientist. And so people who see you in lab, those are the people who can give us those recommendations. The better the person knows you, the better the letter. So sometimes it might be tempting to go to the chair of the department or the head of your research program. If that person knows you really well, great. But if that's somebody who's going to write a standard letter of this person is a student, they have this GPA, they're going to write a few things that are on your CV and that's it, that's not helpful to us. That other professor who you've worked with for the last 2 years, who might not have a big position, and maybe a new assistant professor, but they can give us detail about how you are in the lab and your ability to understand material and to train others and things like that, that's going to be a much better letter. All right, so on to interviews and making a decision. The interview is where we kind of get to know you a little bit beyond what's on paper, right? We want to see your personality, we want to see who you are. It's opportunities to provide some context beyond what we can read in the application. You should be ready to present and discuss all of your research. So if you describe 4 different research opportunities, go back and review, what did I do again, what experiments, and be able to have a conversation about them. Practice your pitch, practice your 1 to 2 minute description of what you did in that project and be ready to answer questions. You have to show some enthusiasm for the program, right? You show up and you say, oh, I got 20 interviews, yay me. Why would they give you an offer? You have 19 other offers or options. Why are you coming there? But if you are able to say, well, what I really love about this program is this, I'm excited about that, then they get excited about you as well. Most times you're going to get a list before of who you're going to interview with. I would review them. Nowadays, you just go online and Google and look at what the last paper they published. Most people have a website. You can see what kind of research they do. I wouldn't go overboard because sometimes these change, right? On the day of your interview, somebody gets sick. They have to go pick up their dog, pick up their kid or whatever. And somebody else interviews you. You don't want to send yourself into a frenzy because you spent 2 weeks researching every single thing that person ever did. But you just want to be prepared in general to be able to ask about their science, especially if it's the science you're interested in. You do HIV research, they do HIV. Go and look and see a last paper and think, oh, well, this question is interesting and people love it. I'll tell you, that's a good in for any scientist. If you can talk science with them, then they're like, oh, you're ready to be here. They're going to love you. And remember, this is a 2-way interview. So as much as we're interviewing you to see if you're a good fit, you're interviewing us to see if this is a good fit for you. So you should come prepared with questions. For faculty, you're asking about the program. You're asking about resources. You're asking about opportunities and so forth. For the students, you're asking about climate. What is it like to be a student here? How did you transition to living in the city or being at the school or being in this program? What do you like about it? What don't you like? Remember that your interview starts when you step off the plane or train or car or Uber or whatever, and it finishes when you get back on that mode of transportation, right? Everything is being watched. Don't get fooled with, all right, I walk into the room, I do this great interview with the professor, I close the door, and I'm walking with the student, and now I'm just like cussing and doing whatever and saying, oh my gosh, that interviewer was terrible, and so on. Those students are watching all that stuff, and it usually is going to get back to the admissions committee. Okay, everything is being watched. They'll tell you, hey, we're going to go out for drinks after, and you think, oh, it's fun time. Please don't go and get drunk. Okay, I mean, that is not necessarily a done deal that you won't be accepted, but people are looking at all those things, and all of those things do form impressions for the students who go back and report to the people who are making decisions. So the entire thing is an interview, and you should treat it as such. All right, once you get some offers, you got to trust your gut on where you should be going. You want to think about the overall training, right? So the coursework, the mentors, the science, the opportunities that you will have. The environment matters. It doesn't matter if the institution is fantastic. If it's in a city where you're going to be unhappy, it's probably not a good idea. Don't join a program for one person. So sometimes you have that one professor, you really love them, you love their work, and you're like, I want to go work in that person's lab. If that's the only thing good about that school, you don't want to go there, because that person can change institutions. That person might not be accepting students when it's time for you to do a rotation. That person might be a monster and you have no idea. They look good on paper, but you go and talk to them and they're the most racist person you've ever met. So you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to go to a place where there are multiple labs, where you can see yourself going and do a rotation, where there are multiple things about the program that you like. Talk to your mentors, have discussions. It's a big decision, so you should really take your time to make a good decision about it. All right, so I'm gonna stop the recording now, and then I'll open up for questions.